Being the new guy in Vietnam was terrifying, but there was something worse, having 10 days left. They were called short-timers, men with fewer than 30 days remaining on a 365-day tour, men who could almost see the plane home. And the closer they got to that plane, the more the fear ate them alive. Every snapping twig sounded like a rifle bolt sliding home. Every trail looked like it was seeded with mines. Every patrol felt like the one that would kill them on day 364. They had survived the ambushes, the monsoon, the heat that rotted a man's boots off his feet. They had survived the enemy, the jungle, and their own worst days. And now, with almost nothing left to survive, they were coming apart. This is the story of the men who lived through almost everything Vietnam could throw at them, and then had to live through the last 10 days. To understand the terror, you have to understand the clock. The American war in Vietnam ran on a single number, 365. For the Army and most of the services, a tour was 12 months. For the Marines, it was 13. From the moment a soldier's boots hit the tarmac at Da Nang or Bien Hoa or Cam Ranh Bay, one date mattered more than any other. They called it Daros, date eligible for return from overseas. It was the day you went home. And every man knew his own, down to the hour. This was not how America had fought its wars before. In the Second World War, men shipped out with their units and came home with their units when the job was done. In Vietnam, the machine ran differently. Each man arrived alone, on his own schedule, and left alone, on his own schedule. Your war began the day you landed. It ended the day your number came up. What happened in between was yours to survive. And so every soldier became an accountant of his own life. He knew exactly how many days stood between him and the Freedom Bird, the plane that would carry him back to what everyone called simply the world. 300 days out, the number was an abstraction. 100 days out, it started to feel real. 30 days out, it became a live grenade sitting in a man's chest. Because now the arithmetic worked against him. He had beaten the odds for 11 months, and the closer he came to the end, the more he understood exactly what he stood to lose. Picture a patrol somewhere in the Central Highlands. 1968. A rifle squad pushing through elephant grass taller than a man, the kind that cuts your forearms to ribbons and hides everything past arm's length. There's a soldier near the back of the file, 20 years old, 17 days left. He is not walking like the others. He tests every footfall before he commits his weight, watching for the thin trip of monofilament that means a grenade wired to a tree. He flinches at the click of a beetle. When the point man raises a fist to halt the column, this soldier drops so fast he knocks the wind out of himself. The others notice. They always notice, because they've seen it before. The 1,000-yard caution. The man who stops volunteering. The man who used to walk point and now finds reasons not to. The man who, on a good day, was one of the best soldiers in the platoon, and who is now nearly useless, because every fiber of him is bent on one task and one task only, staying alive long enough to leave. There's a word for what was happening to him. The men who studied it later would call it short-timers syndrome. Out in the bush, it needed no name. Everyone recognized it. Most of them were terrified of catching it themselves. The syndrome had its own rituals, its own folk objects, its own strange little machines for counting down a life. The most famous was the short-timers calendar. It was usually a drawing, sometimes a cartoon character, sometimes the outline of a woman, divided into numbered sections, like a paint-by-numbers picture. Each section stood for a day. Every night, the short timer filled in one more square, watching the image slowly complete itself as the days bled away. Some men started coloring at 100 days. Some waited until 30. The Red Cross volunteers, the young American women the troops called donut dollies, handed out clean cartoon versions at the 100-day mark. Then there was the short timer's stick, a length of wood, notched or carved, cut a little shorter with each passing day. One veteran kept his for the rest of his life. He'd built it from a spent 105mm howitzer primer and a 50 caliber round. A piece of the war turned into a countdown. Others made chains, one link removed each morning, or marked the days in ink on their helmet covers. And they talked. God, how they talked. The short timer's boast was its own art form. I'm so short I have to look up to tie my boots. I'm so short I could sit on the edge of a dime and swing my legs. 25 days and a wake-up. That last phrase carried the whole psychology in 5 words. You didn't count the last day. The last day you were awake for a few hours and then you were gone. So the count wasn't days plus 1. It was days and a wake-up. It sounds like humor, and it was. but it was the kind of humor men used to hold back something much larger and much darker, standing just behind it in the dark. The behavior went further than jokes. Men who were getting short-changed how they fought. Some piled on gear, an extra flak jacket, an extra bandolier, anything to put more layers between themselves and the round they were certain had their name on it. In the helicopters, troops learned to sit on their helmets and flak vests, because the deadliest fire often came straight up through the floor. And they stopped taking chances they'd once taken without a thought. For the most part, the platoon let them. There was an unwritten law in the bush, and nearly every unit honored some version of it. You looked after your short-timers. You kept them off point in their last weeks. You found them a reason to stay back at the firebase. When a man was down to single digits, the squad quietly arranged his life so that he stood the best possible chance of walking onto that plane. It wasn't in any regulation. No manual required it. But the men enforced it themselves, because they understood something the manuals didn't. The death of a short-timer was the worst kind of death a unit could suffer. A man killed on his first week was a tragedy. A man killed in his last week was something closer to an obscenity. It broke the one promise the war seemed to make, that if you just held on, if you just counted it down, you got to go home. So they protected them. And the short-timers let themselves be protected, and hated themselves a little for it, and counted the days. Because everyone knew the story of the man who didn't make it. Every unit had one. Sometimes it was true. Sometimes it had traveled so far from the original that no one could say. But it was always the same story at its core. The man who was almost home. The most famous version was written down by a Marine lieutenant named Philip Caputo, one of the first Americans to land at Da Nang in 1965. His memoir would become one of the most widely read books ever written about the war. And in it, by his account, he recorded the deaths of 2 men who were killed by a booby-trapped artillery shell with only a handful of days left in their tours. Almost out, almost home, and then gone, in an instant, on ground they had walked 100 times before. Caputo drew a single hard lesson from it, a proverb that ran through the whole war like a live wire. You're never a short-timer until you're home. Not when you've got 10 days. Not when you've got 1. Not when you're strapped into the seat with the engine spinning up. Until the wheels are down in the world, you are still in the war, and the war does not care how many days you have left. Every short-timer knew that proverb, and every short-timer heard it in his own head, on every patrol, on every chopper, on every long night in the last month. It was enough to drive a careful man half mad, and here is where the story turns, because the terror was real, the paranoia was real. The men coming apart in their final weeks were not imagining the weight on their chests. But the thing they feared most, that their luck was statistically running out, that the final days were the deadliest, was not actually true. The numbers, as best we can reconstruct them, tell the opposite story. The most dangerous time in a soldier's tour was not the end. It was the beginning, the new man, the cherry, the one they called the FNG. He was the one most likely to die, and he usually had no idea. He didn't yet know the difference between a safe sound and a killing one. He didn't know how to read the ground, how to space himself in a column, where to look when the shooting started. Combat veterans put it plainly, most casualties happen in the first months because the new men don't yet know where the fire is coming from. The historian David Grossman documented something chilling about this. Experienced soldiers often refused to learn the names of replacements, refused to befriend them at all, because the new arrivals were so much more likely to be killed. Getting close to a cherry was setting yourself up for grief. So look at the cruel symmetry of it. The new man was in the most danger and felt almost none of it. The short-timer was in the least danger and felt all of it. The fear ran exactly backwards to the risk. A man could survive the deadliest stretch of his war without ever losing a night's sleep, and then spend his safest weeks paralyzed by a terror that the odds themselves did not support. That is what the war did to the mind. It didn't just try to kill you. It rearranged the way you were afraid. Now, a fair warning to anyone who's heard this story told 100 times. The clean statistic doesn't exist. The records that survive from Vietnam list when a man died. They do not reliably list how long he'd been in country when it happened. So no one can point to a perfect chart proving cherries died at twice the rate of short-timers. What we have instead is the consistent judgment of the men who were there, and of the historians who studied them, and the plain logic of inexperience getting people killed. But that uncertainty almost makes the point sharper, because the short-timer wasn't reacting to a statistic. He couldn't have been. The The statistic didn't exist for him either. He was reacting to a feeling, to the weight of everything he now had to lose, to 11 months of watching other men not make it. His fear was manufactured entirely inside his own skull, and it was, in its way, the purest fear the war produced. Not fear of an enemy in front of him, fear of the door standing open behind him. So why did the American war torture its soldiers this way? Why send men home one at a time, each with his own private clock ticking down toward his own private terror? The answer is a policy decision, made early, that shaped everything that followed. When the buildup began in 1965, President Johnson chose not to mobilize the reserves and the National Guard. That meant there weren't enough whole units to rotate in and out as formations, the way America had fought its earlier wars. So the Army rotated individuals instead. Each man got a date. Each man served his year. Each man went home when his number came due, whether his buddies had 2 days left or 200. The generals defended it. They argued the one-year clock was good for morale, that a man fought better when he had a fixed goal, a day to count toward, a light at the end. And they weren't entirely wrong. The countdown did give men something to hold on to, but it came at a terrible price, and the price was the unit itself. There was never a stable band of brothers who trained together, bled together, and went home together. There was only a constantly churning line, men arriving green, men leaving broken. The group reformed every single week around whoever happened to still be there. One of the sharpest minds of the war, an advisor named John Paul Vann, cut the whole thing down to a single sentence. The United States, he said, had not been in Vietnam for 9 years. It had been in Vietnam for 1 year, 9 times. Every soldier lived that sentence. He wasn't part of a campaign with a beginning, a middle, and an end. He was serving his 1 year. And the loneliest stretch of that year was the last mile, when the men around him still had months to go, and he was counting down alone. And then, if he made it, came the strangest part of all. The transition home was almost violent in its speed. A man could be in a firefight in the jungle, and roughly 48 hours later be standing on American soil in a clean uniform, with no one around him who understood where he had just been. In the Second World War, men came home slowly, together, on ships. They had days and weeks at sea to decompress, to talk it out, to begin the long walk back toward being a civilian, surrounded by the only people who could possibly understand. The Vietnam soldier got no such passage. He left the way he had arrived, alone. One man with one date peeled off from the war and dropped back into a country that had, in many cases, turned against the very war he'd survived. There were no parades. Often there was no one waiting at all. For many, the terror of those final days didn't end when the wheels touched down. It followed them home, and it stayed for decades, and eventually the country would give it a name. Post-traumatic stress. The war that kept being fought long after the last patrol. The short-timer's greatest fear had always been that he wouldn't make it out. For too many, the harder truth was that a part of them never fully did. It's worth noting how differently it could have been done, because there were men in that same war who fought it another way. The Australians sent their infantry to Vietnam too, into Phuoc Tuy province, from 1965 onward. But the Australian army largely rotated as units. Whole battalions trained together, deployed together, and came home together. Their conscripts weren't dropped in as lone replacements. They were folded into the units they'd trained with and shipped out alongside their mates. The Australians used the same slang. They knew what a short-timer was. But the isolating, solitary countdown that haunted the American grunt, the private clock, ticking alone, appears to have hit them far less. When you go home with the same men you arrived with, you don't count down by yourself. It's a quiet, powerful lesson buried inside the whole story. The American short-timer's terror wasn't just the enemy, or the jungle, or the odds. A great deal of it was manufactured by a policy, by the decision to make every man fight his own separate, lonely war, and to send him home from it alone. So the next time you hear about the new guy, the cherry, the FNG, stumbling terrified into the jungle for the first time, remember the other end of that tour. Remember the man on the far side of the year, the one who had already survived everything, the one who knew exactly how many mornings stood between him and the freedom bird, the one who was, by the numbers, probably safer than he had ever been, and more frightened than he had ever been in his life. He wasn't afraid of dying exactly. He was afraid of dying now, when he was this close, when the door was finally open. You're never a short-timer until you're home. Every one of them carried that sentence out of the jungle. The lucky ones carried it all the way to the plane. If you found this one worth your time, YouTube seems to think you're going to like the video on your screen right now. Go ahead and give it a watch.